Um, Hi, I'm Sam Russell. I do labour history amongst other things. Welcome to the course that we're running on labour history in Australia. Um, I'd like to start properly by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land and the fact that they never gave it up, and to pay respects to their elders past and present. Um, it is a labour history course, so for people who don't know how history works, it's a human practice where we basically look at what people did and said in the past and analyse it mainly through looking at the contents of what was said and what's in documents and arguing over it. So the arguments that hopefully we'll have together, positive arguments, expressive arguments, will be in that mode, but it doesn't have to be something that's only done in a scholarly way. The questions this course will go over are stuff like what is labour and what is useful human activity. So in our society, most of us labour for a wage or for an absence of a wage for stuff that should be paid in our society, whereas we're going to deal with instances where societies of wage labour come into contact with ones without wage labour, and looking at it through that kind of class issue of what do people do to survive and how does that create the relationships amongst them and how they think about it. So with that kind of theoretical start, the issue today is Australia before there was an Australia. So most of us know that Australia was invaded from 1788 through to about the 1940s or 1950s, when the Australian government managed to actually have a hold over this society fully. But before there was an Australia, people did work in various ways. And this is the issue that I want to talk about in terms of the past, and then move on into the discussion to talk about how people working and living in the past impacts on our own lives generally. So the biggest question, and this is the question which unfortunately I am no expert in and know in fact the least about anything I'll talk about in this course, is was there labour in the variety of societies in Australasia prior to European contact? Specifically, did labour exist in Aboriginal cultures, in Torres Strait Islander culture, and in Maori cultures? Now, off the top of my head, I can answer no very clearly because we know that there wasn't capital existing in the form we know it in our society. People didn't work for wages or for an absence of wages. We have to work to survive in our society. But the question then is, how did people sustain themselves in these societies? Now, and I may be very wrong in speaking about Aboriginal cultures before European invasion, but my impression is that generally these cultures subsisted through gathering, so resource extraction from the natural world, and from managing the natural world so as to gather more effectively. So people transformed the world in very broad ways, which people normally don't think about in terms of gathering hunting societies. So massive land transformation through burning and through land maintenance, including through the exploitation of protein resources that humans go crazy for when they get access to it, and changes in the amount of protein in the landscape. But the ways in which people related to each other in Aboriginal cultures don't seem to have involved the hierarchy that we can see, at least in Maori cultures, in the similar time frame. Aboriginal cultures seem to have been fairly unitary in a way in which our cultures aren't. So while they were internally divided by age, and particularly by moiety concepts, so concepts of how people marry, which was very important, this still doesn't seem to have resulted in a distinct group of people sitting above everybody else, living off the backs of other people, which I think is something that we should really acknowledge about Aboriginal cultures prior to invasion. The question then arises, how do societies where people living off the backs of others emerge? And it seems, based off my anthropological readings, which aren't that great because I'm far out of date. I mean, the biggest that I've read is Engels on Family and Kropotkin on Mutual Aid. And my understanding is that this kind of research has moved on quite a bit from those days, that concentrations of wealth in a society, changes in the production of wealth, give rise to groups of people exploiting that wealth significantly and in a way that's reproduced down through generations. And I think it would be really interesting to get more information on Aboriginal land uses which did concentrate wealth, so the burning system and also the system towards fish farming and cultivation which happened in Victoria, I believe, and whether these did give rise to a separate class. Now, I don't think that they did from what I understand, but then again, this is not an area that I'm expert in, and I really want to acknowledge that. I also know absolutely nothing about Torres Strait Islander culture at all, which is a major gap in my knowledge, but I do know that they had different forms of society to Aboriginal cultures and know at least that much, but I know nothing about the way in which people produced and consumed wealth. Maori cultures do seem to have been heavily classed. They seem to have a ruling class that was sustained through generation after generation through a selective system, which also involved a body of people who were considered as full members of society, and also the taking of slaves. Now, when we mention slaves, obviously we're not talking about the US system of capitalist slavery. We're talking about a very different form of slavery, but it does involve unique hierarchical social relationships which were continued on through the ages. And given the very little I know about Maori cultures before invasion, I don't really want to express an opinion here because I'm in doubt myself and I'm really not the best person to mention this, but I think it's very important to acknowledge people did exist in Australia, in Australasia generally, in sustained ways prior to invasion, and that also existed outside of Australasia prior to invasion, which is the area which I'm more confident speaking about, the international world system centred in European trade. This existed before Australia was invaded, and it existed through a number of areas I'm going to talk about. It existed in the contact in the far north between traders from what is now Indonesia and Aboriginal peoples, and it also existed through European and American traders, whalers and military vessels. It also existed in the European home territories because these were the class relationships that would be brought into Australia. And before I move on, I also forgot quite significantly, Aboriginal cultures in Australia did conduct long-distance trade and long-distance cultural trade, but it's not trade in the manner of which we think of, like, you know, moving millions of tons of shipping around the world for capitalism. So the fact that trade existed did not mean that currency as we live it existed. It meant that there were complex social networks that were existing without a generationally sustained bunch of people living off the backs of others. Talking about European and American labour before there was an Australia, which would impact on the invasion. Shipping is really quite interesting. Wage labour existed on ships, on individual ships, but it was paid at the end of the voyage. Both trading and military ships embodied a community of working people, and had become very much separated by the time of invasion into the masters of ships, the investors and the insurance agencies, and the people on ships. So the ship community had very few bosses on it, but a large body of foremen, and the body of ordinary workers was often not culturally or ethnically homogenous. Ships in trade and ships in military voyages tended to be brought up from the international population of sailors moving around ports, which meant as you got further and further east into European occupation of the globe, you got fewer and fewer Europeans working on ships on these routes. Military ships tended to have more women than civilian ships, so the practice of having women on civilian ships tended only to be restricted to captains, to the bosses and foremen of ships. Whereas on military ships, part of the structure of continuing the very long process of military indoctrination involved a community of primarily men from about 6, 7, 8 up into the 40s and 50s. But the care of children on ships, particularly the children of people who would be brought into the officer group, required, at least on English ships, to have women on board to look after the young midshipmen. A small number of women, but they weren't gender homogenous. The other thing is, of course, in the late 19th century, we know that a number of young women passed as men to work on ships. So there would be this to a certain extent, but the fact that they were passing as men meant that they lived in and of a community of men as men. The other real thing which I want to cover, and this will make this a short introduction today, is the position of the labouring people and working class in the islands of Britain prior to invasion. England was a very advanced early capitalist society in this period. It had long-distance trade, the concentration of financial and trade capital, and the government was utterly dependent on the money market. However, this didn't mean that wage labour was generalised throughout English, British, Irish, Scottish society. What often happened was in urban areas there was a traditional working class who was largely wage dependent, but the people they worked for weren't capitalists in the sense that we think of capitalists today. So the production of predominantly building or trade goods in the large cities in the islands of Great Britain were done to maintain and sustain traditional living relationships. They weren't done on the basis of a self-expanding capital, ever-increasing production, swallowing up former capitals. This came into play between 1750 and 1850. British society, under the charge of England, was transforming towards a generalised capitalist wage labour society, but prior to invasion it wasn't cemented. In the rural areas of Great Britain, two bodies of working class existed. The first is skilled workers predominantly in mines, where for about 600 years before 1800, long-term conflicts between the owners of mines and the working class in mines working for wages had existed. But again, the mines were primarily producing for a relatively static economy with low growth rates. It wasn't capitalism ever self-expanding in the way we think of it from the birth of the cotton mills onwards. It was a very static relationship. The other group of wage labourers in Great Britain were fairly new. These were the agricultural wage labourers. Now, wages had existed in British agriculture from time immemorial, but they weren't the primary way people sustained their lives. People sustained their lives primarily through local self-production and internal trade. Wages weren't as important as having a common share and having access to a cow, or being a cottager and having access to cheap grain that you'd buy off your employer. So it was more like payment in truck rather than payment of wages to buy on a general market. Now, this was changing with the enclosures because the price of grain was increasing in England due to a monopoly and due to the early expansion of capital. But prior to invasion, the conflict over enclosure hadn't reached its peak, and a large number of people living in Britain were still surviving primarily off their cow, off what they could glean from the boss's fields, so freely gather, and they were also surviving based off stuff like, you know, working for the boss but buying back off the boss directly, so not going out to an open market of goods in order to sustain themselves. So while labour didn't exist in Australasian societies, even though in Maori societies slavery and class society existed, in England labour didn't fully exist either. It was a marginal form of the way in which people reproduced themselves, even though it still did exist. So taking from that, the questions we can kind of talk about ourselves are, what is it to do personally or socially useful behaviour for others and in the eyes of others? How is this different to working or labouring in a class society where people ride your back to sustain themselves? And what was happening outside of Australasia prior to invasion? So what had happened in transnational European society, where you've got pockets of wage labour for capitalism that isn't really capitalism yet, where people have to live their lives sustained off goods, but their employer isn't really a capitalist, they're kind of a something else kind of boss. So I think that's probably a good introduction, and around that basis we can probably nut out some of the issues, like Is it desirable to live in a society with generalised heterosexuality and strict marriage controls, where people mostly sustain themselves, even though it's not a class society? Is it desirable to live in a society of transnational wage labour and peasant labour, where the sustenance of life is very highly dependent on the owners of land, whether it's a good 50 years or a bad 50 years? So one of the sources I read prior to this was about Hammond and Hammond's Village Labourer, where they talk about the England of the past in the 1750s, where every wage labourer had meat every meal. Whereas by 1850, people are arguing wage labourers should eat porridge without milk and potatoes to sustain themselves. And perhaps this is the final point. Society in Great Britain already had major divisions inside it, which were organised around religion and nationality. So one of the sources I've read, the Hammond and Hammond Village Labourer source, says, you really want a Scottish foreman. They're bad workers because they're too self-conscious. But when you get a Scottish foreman in to fuck over village labourers, they will do them to the teeth in the way in which an English foreman won't. So prior to Australia existing, there was already this structure of racialisation. And for anybody who doesn't know it, the Irish were pretty much the bottom of the religious and national ladder at this time, who were suspected to survive on potatoes alone, largely, because of the success of British agricultural capital owners, not quite capitalists, in stuffing down the Irish. So already, even before Australia existed, many of the fractures that would exist in invasion, distinct concepts of racialism, an idea of useful agriculture being certain things, the idea of European society being necessarily superior existed. And when we talk about societies in Australasia, Aboriginal societies, Torres Strait Islander society, Maori societies, we should really watch how we think about them, because I still think we still have this idea of the way in which Europeans do it is necessarily better, or its counterpart, the way in which people prior to the Europeans did it, was necessarily good. So I think that's a great point to stop the recording, stop speaking, and start talking amongst ourselves about these issues.